This is the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast with Garry Taylor.
Hello and welcome to the latest Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Hope you are well. So, as some of you may know, the AMHT hold an annual event in January, namely the Walter Hayes Memorial Lecture. And we're delighted this year to have Marek Reichman as the guest speaker this time. So it seems appropriate, and we are recording this podcast here at the Aston Martin Heritage Museum, the Barn, and we thought it'd be appropriate this time to remind ourselves and you as to who was Walter Hayes. Some of you may know him as being chairman of Aston Martin. Some of you may know him as the driving force behind the DB7, which some suggest saved the company. Some may think of Formula Ford, Formula One, and so on. But we want to know something more about the person himself, and who better to invite to this podcast to remember Walter than his son, Richard Hayes, who is now a council member of the AMHT. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to the Trust too.
So, Richard, where do you think we should start to, can we sum up Walter Hayes straight away before we get into the detail?
Yes, I think... it's lovely to have the opportunity to talk about him. Personally, he had quite a lot of press coverage and did a number of interviews, but they were never about him, really. He always was representing a company or a project. And so what I've done is I've collected some insight into him from various interesting people who worked with him. And the insight comes from letters, comments in books, or press cuttings. And the people I'm going to reference are, in alphabetical order, Ian Callum, Colin Chapman, Keith Duckworth, Emerson Fittipaldi, Henry Ford II, R.J. Miller, Max Mosley, Red Poling, the Duke of Richmond, Sir Jackie Stewart, Ken Tyrrell, and the Duke of Windsor. So it gives you a sense of what an eclectic life he had. These were all people he met through his work, but who he became close to, I think, because they liked each other and it was an amusing experience to do things together. And together they made some very important things happen. So what I would say firstly was that there were really three parts to his working life. He began as a journalist on Fleet Street, and then he moved into the car world, joining Ford and then retiring from Ford and being resurrected to work with Aston Martin and then to become chairman. And the interesting thing was that he was not from a family that was in any way automotive. And no one seems to quite know how it was that he developed such a good sense of touch for car projects.
I think you said earlier on that his parents, they were partly involved in journalism, but it was more on the printing side of things.
Yes, they were. His father worked as a printer on Fleet Street, and I think that's where his interest developed. But his interest, although he was interested in printing, and when we were young, he bought us, I think it was called a Nadana, was a printing press. And it came with blocks of letters, and it had a circular disc that you put thick ink on, and rollers went up and down. And so we printed off letterhead. It took us a few weeks to get to set the blocking, I think it's called, right. But so that was interesting to him. But he was really a writer, a journalist. But he was really self-taught. Anyway, so he always seems to have risen to the top, and actually he became in 1956 the youngest ever editor of a national British newspaper, which was the Sunday Dispatch, and he held that record for 38 years until Piers Morgan was appointed editor of the News of the World in 1994. On the automotive side, what was unusual about him was that he played leading roles in both road and racing car projects. And many of them were of significant consequence and success, and he was very effective both in changing perceptions of companies and in fortifying them and improving their financial state, really. I think also, to give a sense of his personal characteristics, based on my knowledge of him and what close friends or colleagues had said, the one thing that really stood out was he was very well known for his being very good at giving advice. He had a very good way of thinking and explaining and encouraging people. And I have examples to give later from the Duke of Richmond, and a particularly interesting one from Max Mosley. So he had a very creative mind, and
do you think many people, you say he's good at giving advice, so people went to him to seek counsel?
Yes, exactly. Well, the thing was that, by the late 60s, he'd been behind a total transformation of Ford's image and had helped drive support for more sophisticated and better engineering in the road cars. He was helpful to a lot of people. He supported lots of teams, lots of drivers in different ways. He offered advice to a very young Emerson Fittipaldi. I have the most wonderful set of letters here I'm going to quote from. And so he had a reputation as he didn't really have an axe to grind. You could go along, you could discuss things with him. It would be in confidence. He would quite probably have a good constructive idea. And if he could help you with it, he would. One example, to jump ahead slightly, is in 1993, Charles March, then Lord March, had this idea about having a hill climb. And he was suggested to him that he should go and talk to Walter because he had, knew a lot of people and had a lot of experience in different things. Not in hill climbs, but anyway, so he went to see Walter, and that time he was chairman of Aston Martin, and he said to the Duke, I think it's a terrific idea, and I would like to offer you all the support I can, but I can't offer you too much money. However, I can lend you a DB7, and you can now go to Bugatti and tell them that you started with A, you went to Aston Martin gave you some money, they gave you a car to display, and let's get the ball rolling that way. And the interesting thing was, the Festival of Speed is the most wonderful event. You see the most amazing cars and drivers from the past. I was kind of quite used in my youth to meeting famous Formula One drivers, world champions. So one of the drivers I was most amazed and impressed to see at Goodwood was Junior Johnson, who was one of the founders of NASCAR. Yeah. But anyway, one of the most celebrated, justifiably, elements of the Festival of Speed is the central display that they have outside Goodwood House, which gets ever more dramatic and wonderful. It does. But what's interesting was the very first central display was actually a DB7 on the podium. So,
because I think the DB7 had just been announced at that time as well, wasn't it?
Yes,
it seemed very timely to have that.
There was a model there.
Yeah,
and I think Father, when he offered advice, would back it up with something. But if it also helped him and his work and what he was doing, if it was mutually beneficial, he would suggest it. Right. It wasn't to exploit it; it was to support it. Yeah. And I actually had a very nice email from the Duke when my mother died, which I can quote from with the Duke's permission, if I can find it in my notes here. But he, it'll turn up later, and then I'll read from it. But so advice was one of the reasons his reputation spread.
Because the Duke could have gone to anybody really, but it's rather poignant that he went to Walter first of all to say, "I've got this idea. What do you think about it?"
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm sure he spoke to other people. He had a good growing team at Goodwood, and they are a very bright bunch. But I think Charles was, look at what a role he performs now for the automotive road and racing world. But at that time, he was an outsider. So Walter was good, but I'm sure he spoke to other people as well.
It's rather interesting you've put down, I've got a list here of his personal characteristics. One of them is the soundness of his advice, his creative mind and lateral thinking. I think one of the things that comes to mind, that's 2 out of 5, we'll come on to the others later, was that I seem to remember somebody saying you'd often find Walter be in his office looking out the window with his pipe, and he would be thinking the problem through. He always seemed fairly relaxed gentleman.
Yes, there was somebody mentioned going to see him in his office when he was based in Dearborn, and he was sort of leaning back in his chair with his feet on the desk, and his pipe was burning away, and he did like to take time to think and reflect, and the pipe helped him. I have a picture of him in his Fleet Street days at an editorial meeting, and his pipe was there with him, and that would have been in his early 30s. And there's a very funny scene. Ford released a short documentary in about 1968 called 9 Days in Summer, which was about the development of the DFE engine. And there's a meeting in the boardroom with, I think, Colin Chapman, Keith Duckworth, and my father, and they're talking, and while he's talking, my father lights his pipe and fills the room with smoke. And, that was okay in those days. And it must have been a bit hard to see, but Colin Chapman ignores it. I think they were used to it. But it did seem to be a tool to help him relax and to help him think.
Yes. It seemed to be his prop. I remember you saying when we was talking about before the podcast, I think he had his pipe, he took it to the Le Mans pits and lit it up there, and I think he was allowed to get away with it.
Yes, we went to a test weekend with John Wyer when he was running Gulf Mirage, and he had 2 cars. One had the DFE, Cosworth Ford, and the other had a Westlake V12, and they were comparing the engines with Hardin Ganley driving the Cosworth and Derek Bell driving the V12. And we stayed in the famous hotel at Le Chartres, which had been the Aston Martin base, and then John Wyer used to go back there. And, there was a moment when, Walter was standing sort of not that close to the car, but he just started thinking, and he got his pipe out and lit it. And I could see one of the mechanics was quite appalled and wanted to do and say something, but wasn't sure he should. But I think Walter came to his senses pretty quickly and put it out, so there wasn't any drama. A couple of other characteristics I've listed. He had great drive and determination. He really liked to have an idea, think it through, and then make it happen. I think he had a very high success rate. One of his secrets was that he was very happy to work with the best people he could find. And he liked to discuss things, he liked to learn, he liked people's input, he liked to find who was good and give them an opportunity. There's a very interesting book by Graham Robson about the Ford Cortina, Capri, and Corsair. And he talks a lot about Ford in the early 60s, and there was a racing program that wasn't very structured or organized. And there were various people who wanted to get Ford more into saloon car racing. They wanted to have what they learnt in saloon car racing applied to road cars. And Father wasn't the first person to recognize this, but he was in a position he had the authority and the persuasiveness to make it happen. So, when he was talking to Colin Chapman about, well, he had met Chapman in the 50s when he made him the motoring editor of the Sunday Dispatch, and they wrote over 38 articles together. And then when Walter went to Ford, there was Colin, such a big deal in racing, and it occurred to Walter that, Ford and Lotus together could do amazing things. And actually the first thing, which I think was Walter's suggestion, was the Lotus Cortina. And he knew that Duckworth and Chapman had been working on the Anglia engine, because that was had offered great possibilities for development. And now there was the Cortina, which was replacing the Anglia. So he was happy to go find the right people, talk to them, find out what they needed, find out what they wanted, and then facilitate it. And I think Chapman had been connected with racing and Ford earlier through the Indy 500 stuff that he was doing with Jim Clark. And it seems that he said to Walter that he really wanted to do a Formula One engine, and Chapman had already suggested this to Ford, but he hadn't got anywhere with them. And Walter said, well, let's see what I can do. And together they put together what they needed, and of course it happened. So that was his drive and determination, and also finding good people to work with. And also he was ambitious very much for the companies he worked for. He wasn't personally ambitious. He was very well treated and paid and promoted. And, of course, the ultimate experience was to be the chairman of Aston Martin. And that's unusual because, he wasn't a product man. He by profession, by training, he wasn't a finance guy. He was really a marketer and a communicator. But he had these ideas, and then he would sort of press them into service. And I'm just about to read something very funny from a speech given by the soon-to-be Ford chairman at his retirement dinner in London. But Walter liked to really, once he had an idea, if it was a bee in his bonnet, then he wasn't going to just...
He was to talk about.
Yeah. So, and then a couple of other characteristics. He was shrewd. He had a good independent mind, but he was happy to talk and share and absorb ideas. And he was pragmatic. And he would really fight for what he believed in. He really wanted to save Aston Martin. And Ford bought into this. They did buy a share of Aston Martin. They did support the program. They did offer funding, but there were still many people at Ford who just couldn't understand the need to rescue a company that made so few cars. There were various people at Jaguar who were whispering in Ford's ear not to, that Jaguar should be just to quietly, dump it. And Father's pragmatism, he thought, right, well, I've worked with all these four people all these years. I've been in Detroit for 4 years. I know the Ford family. I know Bill Ford, the chairman. I know lots of top people. And he really lobbied. He would, work in Newport Pagnell. He would go home to Shepperton, and he would sit in his study with a typewriter and a fax machine and bang off letters, very blunt, very to the point, very insightful, and he would really put people on the spot. And he would not hesitate to get on a plane and go to Dearborn. And there was one time he was told that Alex Trotman, the chairman, was under pressure to abandon the DB7 project. And so Walter flew to Dearborn, went to Trotman's office, walked in and said, "Do you want to be the British chairman of Ford who killed Aston Martin?" And Trotman said, "Well, absolutely not." And Walter said, well, good. And so he was pragmatic. If he needed to make people feel a bit awkward, if he had to be blunt, then he would. And the ultimate pragmatism I can refer to later was when he launched the DB7 at the Geneva Motor Show without Ford's approval.
Yes.
So we'll come back to that. Anyway, if you spoke to him, he did have some great stories to tell, but he wasn't the sort of person who would say, did I ever tell you about? You had to sort of ask. Although once you asked, then, out they came. He tended to live in the present and the future. He wasn't interested in what he'd already done or what he'd been involved in, but it did lead to some wonderful conversations. I went to the Indianapolis 500 once with him in about 1983, and we bumped into Colin Chapman in the pit lane before the race, and they were so happy to see each other, and it was great. Not everybody around them seemed to realize who they were, but it really didn't matter. They had this very intense and terrific conversation, and Mario Andretti was there and joined in. So those kind of moments happened.
Yes.
A lot of them happened at Goodwood, at the Festival of Speed and at the Track Revival, which is, a fantastic reunion of people and cars and all sorts of things. So he wrote, this is a thought that occurred to me. Graham Gould was the editor of a biography of Jim Clark called Jim Clark, Portrait of a Great Driver, which was published by Hamlin in 1968. And Walter contributed a chapter entitled A Gentle Guiding Hand. And in it, he said of Jimmy, I don't believe that he ever had a lesson in anything. I don't believe anyone ever taught him anything, and I believe that anything he did, he worked out for himself. And it occurred to me, I think the same could be said of Walter. He was a big rugby and cricket fan. He was a member of the MCC. He was a slow bowler, and if you're kind, you'd say a number 10 batsman. He loved the theatre, and he had actually, in his early days at the Dispatch, had been a theatre critic. He'd also covered crime a little bit. And I asked him how this was, and he said the thing was that he was young and ambitious, and quite often there would be a Friday afternoon when everyone was preparing to go home, the journalists, and a sub-editor would walk in and say, right, we need someone to go down to Hampton, or we need someone to go to this play, or we need someone to go to Shepperton. I think it was to interview Lord Olivier and Marilyn Monroe. And Walter said, well, there were always people who were thinking about the weekend. So I made a point of always making myself available. And I think that was probably part of his rise.
Staying with that, it's interesting. A tremendously busy man. Was he able to find time? Did he make time for his family, for yourself, for personal hobbies?
He worked extraordinarily hard, and but I was born in 1957, and by the time I was 10, he was working. He was director of Ford of Europe, and I think 2 years later he was made vice chairman. So we lived in Esher, and he worked in Brentwood, which was quite a drive, and he actually had a flat that he would stay at during the week. And then he was in Europe a lot, and as he started to work with Henry Ford in the mid and later 60s, he started to go to America a lot. So the truth is that he was a very loving an amusing father and a very generous one, but he wasn't around very much. I think he missed most of my birthdays because of my birthday is in October, and I think he missed many of the birthday parties of my childhood because of the Paris Motor Show. He did once. He never. I lived close to school. I used to ride a bike, and I rode always. There was one marvelous time. His company road car was a GT40. Well, which John Wyer had. I think he made 3 or 4 of these road versions at Slough, and the car had an elongated tail, and they had put a sort of luggage compartment in it. It was very small. And I remember going to Slough to see the car with Walter, and I remember John Wyer lifting the back of the car and showing him where a suitcase could go. But John said, but I really wouldn't put a suitcase in there. It will melt. Anyway, there was an infrequent treat, because at my school we had lessons on Saturdays until lunchtime, and there was one day when Walter said, I'll come and get you in the GT40. And I was absolutely overjoyed. And the entrance to the school was at the top of a little hill, and you could see the cars coming towards you from, 700 or 800 yards away. But to my great disappointment, Walter was late. And really, everybody had been picked up and everybody had gone.
Oh, no.
This is a true story. I still remember the intense disappointment. And I had told a friend that my father was coming in a special car, and the friend waited and waited and waited and started to not believe me. And then along came this GT40, and it just looked ridiculous because it was so low and flat and wide. It didn't look like a car, and it seemed to be a sort of low hovercraft that was travelling over the road. So he was a fantastic father, but it occurred to me that I actually moved after university. I went to live in New York, and I worked as an advertising copywriter for J. Walter Thompson. And unexpectedly, the year later, my father finally agreed to go and work in America. He lived in Ann Arbor with my mother for 3 or 4 years, and I went to see them often, and he came to New York. And actually, that was the time when we really got to know each other, and it was very interesting. He was great company. He had some amazing stories going on about Ford at the time, and we carried on. He moved back to England. I stayed in the States. But then there were fax machines, and he would write me regularly, very long, 3 or 4 page faxes, full of what was going on, full of stuff, full of business advice if I called him and asked for help. And so I was really well informed about all the issues going on as he worked his way into Aston Martin as things changed.
I suspect those faxes, I think they were printed on thermal paper. I think they're long faded now.
Yes. Yeah, I have a few serious regrets in my life, and one of them was these wonderful... my office, later on, I was on 57th Street, just between 5th and 6th Avenues, and, every now and then office politics or weirdness would get... And I knew he was giving other people advice, so I would call him or send a fax from the office, and then I would walk home, and I lived up on 76th Street, and I would, on the east side, and I would send him a fax and walk home, and when I got home, which would take 30 or 40 minutes, frequently there would be a 2 or 3 page fax hanging out of the machine. They were always very considered, very thoughtful, very sensible, sometimes not at all what you'd expect to read. And the great tragedy is that I read them and then I threw them away. And I'm really, I wish I could go back and, but that's how you lived your life minute by minute, really. So anyway, then there's one more thing on this sort of to describe him. He was very eclectic. He wrote 3 books. In about 67 or 8, he caught mumps, and he was confined to bed for a month. And he wrote a book, a children's book called Angelica, the Bewitching Witch.
Didn't know about
So that was published. And then later on, when he was based in the States, he and my mother Elizabeth lived in Ann Arbor, and he had this big interest in antiquarian books. And there was a library called the Clements Library that had a fantastic collection of antiquarian books. And he heard about it, and he went along, and he met the people, and he became a trustee. And there was a woman whose name I think was Marion Carson, who had collected books and given some to the library. And she and Father got on very well. And she had the papers from a Nantucket whaler called Mayhew Folger, who was based in Nantucket, who had gone whaling off into the South Seas, and they would disappear for months on end. And he had actually been sailing past Pitcairn Island, which was thought to be uninhabited, and he'd seen signs of life, and he'd moored and gone into Pitcairn and discovered some of the mutineers of the Bounty. He actually met them. They told him the story, and they gave him, I think, a compass or a sextant that had belonged to Captain Blythe, and he sent this back to the Admiralty in England, and this was how the mutineers had been found. So she gave, Marion Carson agreed to give the papers to the Clements Library if Walter agreed to write the book, which he did, and that was published by the Clements Library. And I've given a copy to the Heritage Trust. It's in your amazing files
that's
somewhere.
Fantastic, yes.
And then the third book he wrote, while Henry Ford was still alive, Lord Weidenfeld had dinner with him and Walter and asked Henry to write his autobiography, and it was agreed that Walter would write it. Henry died in 1987, and when Walter retired in 1989, because he liked to be busy and he'd been looking forward to doing this, he wrote the book then, which was called Henry, I have it here, Henry, A Life of Henry Ford II, which was published by Grove and Weidenfeld. And I have a couple of comments about that for later. So anyway, just very quickly to give you a chronology. So he was born on April the 12th, 1924. He died on Boxing Day in 2000. In 1956, he was appointed editor of the Sunday Dispatch. In 1959, he was made associate editor of the Daily Mail. In 1961, he joined Ford of Britain as the director of public affairs. In 1965, he joined the board of Ford of Britain. In 1967, Ford set up Ford of Europe, and he became the vice president of public affairs for that. In 1976, he was made vice chairman. He had worked and travelled a lot by then with Henry Ford, who asked him many times to go and work in the States, but I have an older brother and a younger sister, and he wanted to be based in England, and he wanted as much as he could to be an active father, and not so he agreed. When he did agree to go to the States, my brother had graduated and was I was working in New York, and my sister was at Durham University. So he went, and he was the vice president of public affairs for Ford USA from 1980 to 1984. Then he returned to Europe to be the vice chairman until 1989, when he retired. In 1987, he had recommended to Henry Ford in a private meeting that Ford seriously think about buying Aston Martin. So when he retired from Ford, but he then started to be involved with Aston Martin at Ford's request, and in 1990 he joined the board of Ford. In 91 he was made the Aston Martin Lagonda chairman. In 94 he retired from Aston Martin Lagonda. He had wanted to drive a DB7 off the production line on his birthday and on his retirement, but there had been delays, so he missed that by 6 weeks. But he was nonetheless so happy that the car was going into production. And when he retired from Aston Martin Lagonda, he was appointed life president, and then 4 years later the Aston Martin Heritage Trust was established, and he was appointed the first chairman of that. And then also he was a trustee of the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu. He chaired the Stowe Garden Appeal, and this is an interesting example of how his mind worked. He was made chairman of something called the Redundant Churches Fund, which existed to maintain redundant churches.
Redundant churches, yes.
And the first thing he did was change the name because he felt it was very negative. So he changed it from Redundant Churches Fund to the Churches Conservation Trust. And he was a real breath of fresh air. There was nobody else who'd been involved in Formula One and Aston Martin involved in that trust. And I have some lovely comments that were part of a letter written by the chairman who replaced him to the Times after his death. So I would... everybody who worked with him, or many people, found him very effective and actually quite fun or challenging in different ways. And I do have 2 or 3 things I'd like to read. So the first one is from the speech given at his retirement party from Ford in the Dorchester, London in March 1989. At that point, Red Poling was vice chairman, and he subsequently became chairman of Ford. At that time, I mean, obviously Ford was a very big deal, a very serious business, and everybody was slightly dour. They were all quite serious, earnest American businessmen. And
why was he retiring from Ford? Did he reach an age threshold?
Yes.
Yes. Was that
he was 65.
Right.
And there was nothing he could do about it.
Okay.
That was it.
That's how it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so Red Poling gave a fantastic and humorous and insightful speech, and I've just got a few paragraphs. He said, Ford was totally unprepared for Walter. Excuse me. He did, however, have interesting friends and associates from his press days, notably a racing car engineer turned motorsports racer named Colin Chapman. That friendship led to the Cosworth engine. The rest is racing history and the foundation of Ford's association with the concept of total performance. Now, this is just one of the interesting developments in the company that have come about, directly or indirectly, as a result of Walter's efforts to build up Ford's image and reputation. There have been many. In truth, Walter has stuck a finger, if not his nose, into almost every aspect of our business at one time or another, with or without invitation. Walter had a plan when he arrived to put a jaunty face, as he described it, on the company. One way or another, he would, 1, make Ford more interesting to the buff magazines, 2, raise our corporate visibility in the world of arts and culture, 3, take accurate aim at special markets, and 4, bring the company kicking and screaming, if necessary, back into motor racing in America. There was another expensive project of Walter's I'd like to mention, the Treasure Houses of Britain exhibition. It was a historic first in the world of art, bringing to America priceless works from great English country homes. That was an outstanding success and an achievement worthy of the highest accolades. Although money was in short supply, once again Walter persuaded us to make a big investment in our public image at a time when Ford's reputation was sagging. Treasure Houses enhanced Ford's presence in Washington and our connections to culture beyond our wildest expectations. The museum director told me it took 64 books to hold all the clippings. And I can show you, there's a wonderful photograph of the reception held to do with this exhibition at the British Embassy in Washington. And you can see Walter shaking hands with Princess Diana. And between them is an extremely happy Donald Peterson, who was chairman of Ford at the time.
I will just say we're referring to some photographs. Some of these photographs will appear on our website to support this podcast and in the social media. So please, while you're listening to the podcast or outside the podcast, do dip onto amht.org.uk to see some of the photographs. Richard, carry on.
Okay, so the final comment from Red Poling is marvellous. He ended his speech by saying, "Walter, you've given us the impression all these years that the job has continued to be fun, and you've helped to make it fun for all of your colleagues. For 27 years, you've done what needs doing, with vision, panache, and charm, a total disregard for the conventional wisdoms, and a rather lofty but effective disdain for the rules." So it's wonderful that such a serious company could actually
I was going to say,
accept
because
this.
Ford, you get the impression, very, very by the rules, very conservative, and here is this Englishman comes over just to shake it all up.
Well, I mean, this is what Red Poling was acknowledging,
yes.
that
And they accepted it.
yes. Well, like, what was the first comment? It was something like, we were just not
They
expecting.
were not expecting him.
Yeah, Ford was totally unprepared for Walter. But the thing was, he didn't just walk in with wacky ideas. Already he'd had some profoundly important ideas for Ford in Europe, such as the Lotus Cortina, the Cosworth Ford engine. So he had a track record. But still, they were all very serious. It was a serious company. It employed a lot of people. It had lots of responsibilities around the world. But he was very persuasive. He was very thorough. He was very detailed. He didn't raise ideas until he'd really thought them through. I have an interesting example just coming up. So they learnt that, he might surprise you, he might make you uncomfortable, but it was always worth a listen.
He had backup for it. He had evidence.
Yes.
He had supporting documentation for it.
I mean, they weren't. You might not agree, you might not want to do the ideas, but they were always worthy of consideration. So Poling talked about Walter's disdain for the rules. These are a couple of paragraphs from speech that Ian Callum gave at the Heritage Trust's Walter Hayes Memorial Lecture in January 2017. And of course, Ian Callum is one of the world's greatest car designers. After being head of design at TWR, he then became head of design at Jaguar and Aston Martin. He's designed, I wrote an article for Aston, the magazine. He's designed 4.5 Astons, and he worked very closely with father and really enjoyed the experience and did a phenomenal job. I think still today, you can see the heritage continue in the design that originated with the DB7.
Oh, absolutely. I think the DB7 set the template.
Yes.
For where we are today.
I mean, what Marek Reichman done is fantastic, and the cars are absolutely breathtaking, but there is a little bit of Ian, I think, there. Anyway, Ian, I think what people wouldn't know is that the fight to save Aston Martin, to really get Ford to invest and stay with the investment, was really, as I suggested earlier, quite a bitter battle. There were lots of different sides, lots of discussions, and the difficulty for Walter was that he was in England, and a lot was going on in Dearborn, and also there was Jaguar pitching in and trying to derail things for Aston Martin.
Where do you think the inspiration came from for Ford to buy Aston Martin? Was there a conversation with Victor at some point?
Yes. What had happened was that in 1987, there was a sort of historic rerun of the Mille Miglia, and it was not the wild open, fast and fantastic race. Dangerous. It was controlled, but it was a very important event. And Walter was back in Europe as the chairman of Ford of Europe, and he went to stay, I think it was Casa Maggiore, which had been a base for Aston Martin in the past. And he met Prince Michael and Victor Gauntlet. And Victor Gauntlet told Walter that Aston Martin was very much at the stage where it needed help financially, and it didn't have the designers and engineers, it didn't have the building, the factories, didn't have the sites or the space to fund, create and then build.
It wasn't just financial, which always seems to be a recurring theme of Aston Martin, but beyond that, it just didn't seem to have the resources anyway, no matter how much money was thrown at it.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't
to achieve anything in the timescale it had to.
Yes, it didn't have, the design and engineering staff it needed. Didn't have the manufacturing facilities. They were doing very well with in the best way that they could, but they couldn't. The world was changing, sales were dropping, and it was a struggle. So my father thought about it, and he had a very close personal relationship with Henry Ford. It began as a professional one and continued, but Henry Ford had drawn him into various family issues for support and guidance. And he was a big Anglophile. He had a house, fantastic house, called Turville Grange, which is at Turville Heath, just outside Henley. And they would meet on weekends, sometimes in England. And it happened that Henry had driven to Shepperton shortly after my parents had returned from this Mille Miglia retrospective. And he asked them what they've been doing. And they said, well, we've been to this event and it's magnificent. And oh, by the way, Aston Martin, Walter said, I think we should really consider buying it. And that was the beginning. That was the origin. I think that Henry had also spoken to Peter Livanos, who was a part owner, who had shared the same thoughts. And so what happened was that Henry had retired from Ford, but was still an eminence grise. And he said to Walter, I want you to put together a paper for the chairman of Ford and the board, and do it quickly. So that's what happened. He put together a history of Aston Martin, some of the financials, and made a very serious proposal. And actually, I think the proposal was submitted to Ford in July of 87, and by September, an agreement had been reached to buy, I think it was 75%. Wow. So they moved fast. Henry Ford was very influential in this, and the timing was good because, unfortunately, Henry Ford became very ill in September, and he died in October. But anyway, so to go back to Ian, and Ian picked up on what Red Poling had mentioned, which was Walter's disdain for the rules. Ian said at the lecture that Walter worked tirelessly in Detroit, going over there, selling the idea, saying we've got to build this. This was about January 93. And Walter came in one day and said, we're going to Geneva, the Geneva Motor Show. I said, that's in March. He said, yeah, we'll get one of the first cars. And Ian said to him, but you haven't got full approval from Ford yet, have you? And he said, don't you worry about that. So Ian said, I didn't worry. We turned up at Geneva with the car, and it wasn't actually signed off by Ford. So what had happened was that Walter had decided to apply force majeure to the project. There was a lot of backwards and forwards and hesitations and delays, and he just thought, I know this car is wonderful, we've gone so far with it, and I'm just going to resolve this the way I want to.
So he wasn't being reckless there, he just had a gut instinct that this would work.
Well, depends who you are.
Yeah.
I would say to a great number of people he was being reckless because he didn't have program approval. And I mean, Ford, like any serious company, had its methods and approaches to things, and, you didn't just go ahead and do stuff like that. He told me that when he got back to Newport Pagnell after Geneva, there was a very long line of phone calls and messages. You know the abbreviation WTF?
Yes.
Well, that was the theme. And he told me that he had called, sorry to say, I can't remember who, someone right at the top, and just said, oh, I'm so sorry. I got ahead of myself. But, the great thing is we were sort of given car of the show. It couldn't have gone better. We got fantastic publicity. So if you'll pardon the procedural error, shall we just continue? So Ian said Walter was shrewd, bloody shrewd. But of course, the DB7 got so much attention. And in fact, he took orders, which they were kind of thrust upon Aston Martin. They didn't arrive literally with an order book, but they received orders. And Ian said he got orders written out, and after that, the rest is history. He went back to Detroit, he got the papers signed, and off he went into production with the Aston Martin DB7. But at that point, he said to me, we're going to call it the DB7. He spoke to David Brown, and he said, can we use your name, the DB letters? David Brown gave it his blessing, and so the car became DB7. So
Forever the marketeer.
Yes. Well, I think the thing was he, the DB name nomenclature hadn't been used for a long time, and Walter had a great appreciation for history and style and culture, and I mean the Aston Martin's a remarkable name. It means such fantastic things to so many people, even people who don't really know much about the car. But he knew there was a look and a style and a presence that he wanted to resurrect. And, of course, you can help resurrect it by calling it something that brings to mind all those kind of associations. So, there's one other last couple of paragraphs I read, which also pick up on the themes from Red Poling. This is from Harry Colton, who was the former Ford of Britain press officer who worked with Walter for many years, Brentwood, and then father brought him to Aston Martin, and he became the head of PR. And Harry wrote in an issue of Aston, which was, of course, the Heritage Trust Journal, he wrote that working for Walter Hayes was never dull or uneventful. and for 99% of the time it was actually fun. His management style was intuitive and instinctive, yet it was his skill with people that set him apart from his contemporaries at Ford. And I think that sort of picks up on something you asked a short while ago, that he just didn't behave like a Ford person. My mother told me once that there was a big Ford meeting in Las Vegas where Ford presented the new cars and discussed them with all the dealers. This was a big 2 or 3 day event. And it was very important, very formal, very structured. And a lot of the kind of necessary but stiff speeches you'd expect. But when Walter got up to speak, he cracked a joke. And it changed the atmosphere. And my mother said a lot of people laughed. And Walter looked up and said, not the kind of thing you're expecting from a Ford vice president. And he carried on in that way, and it all went very well. Anyway, Harry Colton said, Walter's powers of persuasion were legendary. His joint presentation with engineering director Harley Kopp to gain approval for the Ford Formula One engine program was covered under any other business in the board meeting and took just 9 minutes.
Oh, that's incredible.
As Walter stated afterwards, Ford had invested £1.25 million to add a synchromesh first gear to the Cortina, while for just £100,000 they got World Championship winning Formula One and Formula 2 engines. So if we just quickly go into... I had a couple of interesting things from journalism. We talked about sort of Walter's lateral thinking and ideas. And he had this idea in 1960 that it was the 25th anniversary of the abdication of Edward VIII. And Walter thought that much had been written about Edward VIII, now the Duke of Windsor and the Duchess, but much had been written about them, but not by them. And he actually went to stay with them in their home, the mill in the Bois de Boulogne, in 1960, in July. And I have here the letter, which begins, Dear Mr. Hayes, and ends with kind regards, sincerely yours, Edward. And and in it they say how much that they're returning the manuscript that they had worked on together with their amendments and corrections, that they had very much enjoyed his visit and the conversation, and that they were interested in some kind of future collaboration,
right, yes.
Other subjects. So that's quite a thing. And then there's one other interesting thing, that there was Walter had interesting ideas about commissioning people, and in October 1960 there was a famous trial in London of Penguin Books for publishing Lady Chatterley's Lover.
Yes.
And the newspapers talked, mentioned that there was a trial, and of course there had been reviews of the book, but the angle Walter chose was to send Evelyn Waugh to write a review, not of the book, but of the trial. And they actually remained in contact for a year or so. And I do have here the first edition of the Evelyn Waugh novel Unconditional Surrender. And the inscription in the front says, for Walter Hayes, a premature Christmas present from Evelyn Waugh, October 1961. So I don't think there are many people who worked in Detroit who had such a background, which was interesting. Anyway, then to follow the idea of commissions, I think we mentioned before Colin Chapman, and Walter made him the motoring editor of the Sunday Dispatch. And they were both very young, and Colin actually said to Walter, well, I'm really not a writer. And
so hang on, he persuaded Colin Chapman,
yeah,
you're saying here, the founder of Lotus, to be the paper's motoring editor?
Yes.
Didn't know that.
Yes.
That's incredible.
Yes. Well, I think, I don't think that Colin went into the offices and sat there. Right. I think the point was that Walter wanted someone he admired greatly, who he saw as a great up-and-coming engineer or designer. He thought it would add prestige to the newspaper and articles of great interest. And essentially, they came up with, together, ideas for the articles that then Colin would discuss and father would write. But what happened was that between June 1958 and July 1959, there were 39 articles published under the Colin Chapman byline. I'd heard about this quite a few times, but I actually managed to go online and Google, and I found a newspaper archive, and I found the articles. And there were two that were kind of interesting to me in particular. They covered a sort of eclectic range of subjects. In December the 14th, 1958, the headline of Chapman's article was, "Safety belts are a must in your car." And, of course, this was 25 years before they became a legal requirement in the UK. And there was another headline that caught my eye, which was May the 3rd, 1959, which was, "New Aston Martin challenges the best in the world." And I thought, well, that could just as well apply to the 1993 unveiling of the DB7 in Geneva. So if we follow that trail to go, I have here some letters from Colin Chapman, which raise interesting things that I have not read myself. I mean, I can't claim to be the world's greatest, authority on what has and hasn't been written about. But I think these letters will be of interest to the people listening. So Colin and Walter had a nice relationship, and when Walter went to Ford, Ford's reputation was not good. The sales were not good, and the image wasn't good, and the cars were not particularly good. And the head of Ford of Britain was called Sir Patrick Hennessy, and he was a friend of Lord Beaverbrook, and they had met, and Hennessy had said he was looking for someone to come and be in charge of public affairs and really give them, a tonic, a boost. And Lord Beaverbrook had recommended Walter, which is...
That's fascinating, because I was always wondering about the leap from the Daily Mail to Director of Public Affairs.
Yes.
And that's what happened.
That was the connection. So Beaverbrook introduced Walter to Sir Patrick Hennessy, and they took to each other, and he got the job. And the idea was, we have to do what we can not only to improve the image, but to improve the cars. And so Walter thought, well, racing improves the breed. Everybody knew about that. And of course, perfect, he was on very good terms, very close to Colin Chapman. So they met. And the big new car that Ford was working on was the Cortina. And Chapman and Keith Duckworth had been working on the Anglia engine for use by Lotus. So they met, and Walter said, well, we've done articles in the past, but we haven't done the real thing, so let's do it. So I think it's true that Walter suggested the Lotus Cortina. And the idea was that it would be re-engineered, mildly redesigned by Lotus, and built by Lotus. And I think originally it wasn't called the Lotus Cortina. It was going to be the Ford Cortina by Lotus, something very close to that. But over time, it changed, and I think that was a very good thing.
I think so. I can't imagine Ford at the time being receptive to having their Cortina hijacked by another brand, if you like. But,
yes.
In hindsight,
yes.
Turned to be the right decision.
Well, I think this would have been one of the very first times that sort of Walter went up against Ford business hierarchy and the way they do things. And
well, they had to change because it was a relatively quiet, conservative company, and they brought Walter in to shake things up.
Yes.
So you couldn't carry on doing the same thing.
Yes. But still, you have to be willing to take a risk. But I think Walter recognised, and I don't think it took much persuasion to get other people to agree that Colin Chapman was fantastic and Duckworth was fantastic, and bringing them in to help Ford was a very, very, clever and worthwhile move.
This is the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast with Garry Taylor.
Please join us again for the second part of this podcast in episode 14 for further revelations and insight from the personal archive of Walter Hayes. We'll also find out how the Cortina came to be driven down a toboggan run by Jim Clark and Henry Taylor, and Walter and Colin Chapman's negotiations to persuade Graham Hill to join Team Lotus in 1967, and how later they proposed to encourage Hill to retire.